Rewilding a Rocky Desert. It's Pradip, Krishen, who will be introduced by Arefa, Tehsin. Environmentalist Pradip Krishen tells us of the inspiring project of rewilding a rocky wasteland into a paradise for migratory birds, and a home for over 300 species of trees, shrubs, and climbers. This session is of crucial importance in a planet being depleted daily of natural habitat and resources. Just a little bit on our two speakers. Pradip Krishen directed feature films before he became a naturalist in 1996. He's published Trees of Delhi, a field guide, and Jungle Trees of Central India. He has directed rewilding operations at Rao Joda Desert Rock Park in Jodhpur since 2006. And he calls himself an ecological gardener now. He will be introduced by Arefa Tehsin. She's the author of several fiction and non-fiction books on wildlife and has recently been shortlisted for the Hindu Young World Good Books Best Author Award in 2017 for her book Wild in the Backyard. Please give them a huge samvad welcome to the stage. Pradip Krishen, introduced by Arefa Tehsin. Thank you.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Aaron. Have you ever thought about leaving the profession that you have been in for the last 15, 20 years and doing something entirely different, following your heart, and then shaking your head with a dry laugh on the impossibility of the thought? We have a man here with us today who has done precisely that, and that too when he has been at the peak of his career, and not just once. Pradip Krishen is a multifaceted and an exceptionally determined man. He started off as a history professor for 5 years. And then he went on to become a filmmaker, giving us iconic films like Electric Moon and Messi Saab, and a 77-episode science series on Doordarshan. Even Shah Rukh Khan has starred in one of his movies along with Arundhati Roy, who has written the movie as well, in which Annie gives it to those ones. After being a filmmaker for 20 years, he decided to become an ecological gardener. His inspirations were the place that he stayed, that is Pachmadi in Madhya Pradesh, and his forester neighbor, if I'm not wrong, who used to take him on long forest walks. Since 1995, Pradip Krishen has been a tree protection crusader. His book, his in fact bestseller, Trees of Delhi, is perhaps the only book which describes the trees of our capital in such detail and in such an easy to understand way. His recent book, Jungle Trees of Central India, is an invaluable addition to the books on Indian flora. What he espouses is simple yet pertinent: plant native flora. Native flora has evolved and adapted itself in those ecologies for millions of years, and they are best suited for those regions. Trees are beings that live with us. They are silent, stoic, and life-giving. Yet they are the first casualties of development in agriculture. I remember my father, Dr. Raza Tehsin, fighting with the General Hospital authorities of Udaipur when they were extending their hospital building to save the only kalp vraksh that we had in the district. After a prolonged struggle, the hospital building authorities finally conceded and decided to spare the kalp vraksh. So I know, Pradip, what goes behind saving a single tree. So it is people like Pradip Krishen who have been so persistent in their pursuits to save these sentinel beings. He takes people on forest walks to spread public awareness. And he also has built 3 native plant gardens in Delhi, Garhwal, and Western Rajasthan. He's currently working on a very ambitious rewilding project in Jodhpur as well as Gujarat. Rewilding is a term which is as beautiful as it is challenging. Today we might hear the story of Bawla, as we call it in Mewari, and Bawlia, as we call it in Marwadi, and Pradip's struggle with it. Before I hand over the stage to Pradip, let me recite a few of my favorite lines. ढलानों पे सीधे खड़े मेरे पेड़ों, नमस्कार है. तुम्हें सब बराबर, क्या कौवा, क्या कोयल, सब बेकार है. ढलानों पे सीधे खड़े मेरे पेड़ों, नमस्कार है. पत्थर भी खाते, मगर फल खिलाते, क्या सत्कार है. ढलानों पे सीधे खड़े मेरे पेड़ों, नमस्कार है. Ladies and gentlemen, the man himself, Pradip Krishen. You're welcome.
Oops. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take you very quickly through a series of pictures and tell you the story of the work we did in Jodhpur, which is a city about 200 kilometers west of where we are now. The city of Jodhpur, most of you will know, is a city that has the iconic fort of Mehrangarh on a rocky outcrop, very much in the center of the city. And what is special about this outcrop is that it is situated on volcanic rock that is rather an unusual rock. It's not granite, which is what you normally find in the Aravallis, but this is an outcrop of something that is called welded tuff. And welded tuff for geologists is basically when a volcano explodes, then all the fine ash that gets blown up into the atmosphere becomes like a cloud and floats and then finally settles. And when it settles on the ground, it gets welded by its own heat. And it forms these flat-faced, very, very fine-grained rocks. And this is a site that is actually designated by the Geological Survey of India as a national geological site for welded tuff. Now, what is funny about welded tuff is, of course, that we have barely any soil in this place. And while we don't really have information of what the environs of Mehrangarh Fort looked like in the past, we have this one painting from 1896 by an English artist, which gives us, I mean, you can probably recognize the euphorbia with its long candelabra branches, but very little else is actually recognizable. And the problem when we set out to actually rewild this place was that it was in the 1930s, one of the Maharajas, Maharaja Umed Singh, was told that, look, you've got an empty wasteland here. You rule over a desert kingdom. And if you want to successfully green your kingdom, we'd like to suggest that you take the seeds of a Mexican and a South American tree called Prosopis juliflora. And it does not seem to require any water. It doesn't require any nutrients in the soil. It grows pretty much anywhere. So if you were to plant Prosopis juliflora in the whole of the kingdom of Jodhpur, you'd have a green desert kingdom. And he used to fly his own airplane. And he went up in an airplane with bagfuls of seeds, and he scattered them throughout the kingdom of Jodhpur. And you can see in this slide a picture from 1896 before the Prosopis was actually scattered, and a picture from 2005 when I first went there. And it was basically a landscape that was choked with this particular invasive tree. So Prosopis juliflora, for those of you who live in India, you probably know that wherever you go pretty much in the dry parts of India, whether it's Delhi or Jaipur or Jodhpur, it is now everywhere. It is ubiquitous. It grows in every patch of land where it is allowed to grow. And the big problem was how to get rid of it. This is a picture also from 2005, and you can see that the hills in the background are completely dominated by that one tree. Now, the problem with this tree is not just that it is hardy and difficult to eradicate, it also secretes a chemical, an alkaloid in its root zone, which discourages any other tree or any other plant from growing close to it. So what it does is it actually outcompetes all its competitors. It doesn't allow them to grow there. And that's why I would say 95, 98% of all the trees growing in this landscape was just this one plant. And local people started calling it Bavliya. The word Bavliya in Marwari means the mad one, the one that doesn't seem to need the normal things that trees and other plants do. So they called it Bavliya. So this was the state we found it in 2005. And when I was asked whether I could green, the area I'm talking about is roughly 70 hectares. For those of you who think in acres, that's about 170 acres. And my first thought was, my God, the first big hurdle we had was, how do you actually get rid of a tree that is notoriously difficult to eradicate? And the next problem was, once you've got rid of it, what do you do to bring in new plants? So we essentially made a proposal to the people who looked after the fort, the trust, the Mehrangarh Museum Trust. And we said, look, the only way to proceed with an ecology like this, with very poor soil, with desert conditions, with very low rainfall, is to actually attempt to do an ecological restoration. So the word rewilding is just an easier way of saying ecological restoration. And the trust initially said, well, look, we don't really know what ecological restoration means or what it involves. So you'll have to explain what it involves, and then maybe we'll go ahead with it. So they asked me to write a little small explanation of what it would involve. And essentially what I told them was that, look, first of all, it involves getting rid of the precipice. However, we do this. And then it's a question of bringing back plants, not simply trees and bushes, but also the grasses and the herbaceous flora that grow in similar rocky conditions in the Thar Desert. And they were a bit dubious about whether this would work or not. And they said, well, show us. I'll give you 3 years. We'll give you 3 years to show that this is possible. And the first big issue, of course, was how to actually get rid of the precipice. And as you can see in this closer picture of the terrain, where in the bottom of the valleys, where there was a little more moisture, it's growing into big trees. As you go up the hills, even there you have bushes. Now, we discovered from the internet that what you need to do to get rid of Bavliya is that it has a budding zone that goes down 28 inches. That was the information we derived from the net. And for safety, we said, okay, 30 inches. We need to go down 30 inches in order to ensure that if we were to cut Bavliya, anywhere between that, it doesn't just coppice and grow again. The issue was, how do you actually cut through this kind of rock? It's not, sandstone is like butter compared to this kind of volcanic rock. And we got a whole lot of very strange ideas coming from local people. We'd say, have you tried to remove this plant? Have you tried to do it? And people would say, yes, full moon night, you put fresh gobar on the plant, fresh cow dung, it'll never come back again. Of course, it's not true at all. Somebody said, why don't you use dynamite? And we said, look, are you joking? And they said, no, we don't mean a big charge of dynamite. We mean maybe 1/100th the normal charge. And we said, look, it's important that we don't actually destroy this landscape, which is a heritage landscape in the environments of this great fort. And they said, no, it won't destroy the little hillocks. But it did. We watched it happen, and it did. And we didn't want to use anything poisonous, because obviously the water, this is part of the passage for underground water. And finally, we were introduced to some people who are known as Khandwaliyas. Khandwaliyas are the miners, the traditional miners of this region. And I was, quite frankly, a little skeptical at first that these miners would be able to handle a rock that was much harder and much more brittle than the sandstone, which is the normal building stone in this region. So we asked the man who's shown the bottom left. His name was Dhan Singh. And we said, Dhan Singh, can you go down 30 inches in this rock? We took him to a small bush, maybe 4 feet high. We said, Dhan Singh, can you show me that you can actually go down 30 inches? And he said, sure, no problem. They use these extremely heavy hammers. The hammer head probably weighs about 4 kilograms. And they use chisels. And what he did was he first sat down on his haunches and he tapped the ground lightly. And then he turned his face away. And he hit the ground hard 2 or 3 times. And I thought he was turning his face away because he didn't want shards of the rocks to go into his eyes, which would have been a reasonable assumption to make. But I discovered later that this was how they actually divined how the rock was interbedded, where it might be hollow from, all the information that he actually needed in order to go into that rock. He derived from just the sound that his hammer made on the rock. It's absolutely brilliant. So over the next few months, we had them digging pits for us. And their brief was, go after the bavlia. Whatever bavlia grows, we want you to take it out. You have to go down a minimum of 30 inches. And if you can go down further and make a deeper planting pit, so much the better. We also took the decision, which turned out to be, we took it quite casually, but it turned out to be a very useful decision, that we were only going to plant where bavlia had shown us that it was possible for a plant to grow in these extremely hostile conditions. So in the first year, we only had a lead time of maybe 3 months before the rains actually came. So we only actually worked in about something like 3 hectares out of the 70 that the park consists of. And we found in that first year that we were bringing in plants from the desert. We were bringing in plants that were adapted to living in rocky conditions in the desert. But we were getting something like 60-65% survival rates because we simply didn't have enough information about what those plants needed. There were planting sites that were higher up. There were planting sites closer to the water. There were planting sites that had a little bit of mud and so on. So we started numbering every single pit. That's an example of the way we numbered every pit. We measured every pit. We took notes about the kind of planting soils we were using in each pit, and we were varying these soils. And over time, we started building up a little database of all the information on how every single pit was doing. And in the first 2 years, at the end of the second year, we started to collate this information, and we started finding patterns. We started finding that if you use an Excel sheet, for example, you could put all the plants of one kind together, and you could actually begin to see that certain plants were not doing well if certain conditions were not being met. And that's how we first began. This is an example of the kind of information that the pit reports were actually yielding. I'm going to now show you just a few of these desert plants because most people don't know what these desert plants look like. You actually have to, if you were to drive out into Jaisalmer, for example, you probably wouldn't see these plants anyway because you're not looking at rocky parts of the Thar Desert, you're looking at sandy parts of the Thar Desert. But the plants that do grow in rocky conditions are actually very, very pretty. I'm going to quickly rush through a few pictures just to give you a sense of what these smaller plants are like. I'm not going to give you all the names because there's a heck of a lot of names, but just to give you a sense that these are very different looking plants. Some of them are succulent, some of them are not. But basically what you find in the desert is that because conditions can be so difficult, rock is much more difficult than sand. You know, in sand, if you go down roughly, say, 2 feet into sand, you'll actually find a bit of moisture. In rock, there's no soil to find moisture in. And some of the best niches, the best ecological niches in rocky places are actually inside cracks. And the narrower the crack, the better the niche, because if it's a narrow crack, basically the soil inside the crack is shielded from the drying effects of the air and the sun. So you're actually getting a bit of moisture even in the narrowest cracks. Now, we began to realize that one of the most crucial allies for us in actually being able to have plants growing in rocky sites was a particular grass called Oropetium, which had a relationship with some liverworts. And the liverworts and the rocks, the grass, that narrow bit that you see in the rock there, is actually consists of both of them. And they go completely green in the wet season, and they dry up completely in the dry season. But they actually are crucial elements in preventing the soil from blowing away when it dries up. And we found that we were actually able to lift up mats of soil with Oropitium growing at the top in order to be able to bring them to the site and actually use them on fairly horizontal portions of rock inside our park. So this is the way we used it, and this is an example of one particular area that was actually greened using these ideas. Now I'm just going to show you how this is one of the early pieces of large rock that we tried to work with when we first began. So in the space of about 3.5 years, I'm going to show you how we transformed this piece of rock with the help of our friends, the Khandwalias, the miners. So they actually began working on this rock site very quickly after we started. And you can see that in some cases they're using crowbars to create little niches, but most of the time they're just working with fairly shallow areas. This is about 6 months after we started. The dry season was upon us, the grasses were drying, but these grasses have really been placed there. This is another 4 months into the first year. This is the following year, also in the dry season. This is the rains of year 2 after the rains. And the end, this is the third year actually of having these plants. So we found it was actually possible to take a rock on which nothing grew, absolutely nothing grew, and actually have it do this kind of thing if you handle it right. The other really exciting thing we did was that very often when we went out into the desert, we tended to find patches of soil that were so evidently different from the soil that we had in the park that we could only look at them and envy them, but we weren't able to actually bring back any of the seeds from those plants and plant them in our park because we didn't have the right soil. So after doing this for several years, I thought, why can't we create little raised containers to have little token areas where some of these soils were present. So the technique we used was to actually go to these areas, take the topsoil on the assumption that the topsoil contained the seeds from the previous year. And we'd bag this seed-containing topsoil, then take some of the rest of the soil and fill them into these containers. And these containers would typically contain something like 4 to 5 feet of soil, like a column of soil in a fairly small area. And then we'd spread the first bags, the seed-containing bags, on top and just wait for the rains. And in every single case, even though each soil was completely different from each other, we managed to just, literally have an exhibit that, in this case, 12 exhibits of 12 of the most beautiful soils and the most difficult plants to actually grow in the desert. This exhibit was completed last year. My last few slides, before I take questions, just shows you how some of the larger landscapes were transformed. This is a photograph from the beginning. This shows you Mehrangarh Fort in the background with the Bavliya, the precipice, filling all the areas where precipice would grow before we actually began our work. This is still the precipice. This is with all the precipice removed. The cactoid euphorbias you see in the foreground were actually planted shortly before this. This is in year 2 with really small things still growing. There are not so much trees yet. This is now year 4 where there's been longer time and more opportunity for things to grow. And finally, the beginnings of a forest in year 7. It's actually, things go really slowly out in the desert. So this was what took 7 years to actually happen. Now, Arefa, I'm actually done with my slideshow. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk. But if the audience would like to do it, happy to answer questions from there.
We can start with the questions from people, but before that, Pradip, I would like to ask you, how was this Baulia actually introduced here in this region, and why is it bad, like, you know, for the region, for the ecologies?
Okay, you can put a mic. Okay. Is it on? Okay. So, Bavlia was actually introduced into India in the 1880s. And British foresters would often look for solutions for how to afforest what are called wastelands. Usually these wastelands are places that have been ruined by human beings. And they looked for shortcuts. They looked for ways of actually having plants that would grow quickly on wastelands. And it was probably a suggestion from something that had been tried out in Africa. But Prosopis juliflora was brought in the 1880s, some seeds from Kew Gardens, and it first was taken to the canal colonies in the Punjab. Within the first 20 years, it wiped out Asia's biggest grassland in Kutch. Kutch got completely obliterated by Bavia. So the problem with Bavia is it is so aggressive. It allows, basically it succeeds at the expense of all native vegetation. Nothing nests in it. Nothing eats the fodder because it's toxic. And it's only the seeds, the fruit and the seeds that are actually eaten. And it's when the seeds pass through the gut of large ungulates or even middle-sized ungulates and the seed coat gets weakened by gastric juices that it begins to germinate. So it's a terrible plant actually. And it's, I mean, those of you who have seen Delhi Ridge, for example, will be aware that, you know, again, 95, 98% of the ridge consists only of this tree which is called Vilaiti Kikar in Delhi. So it's not a good tree to have at all.
Right. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to?
I think let's take questions from the audience.
It's an amazing project that you've put together there, so thanks for sharing that. In Australia, we find that the plants, the exotics, have seeds that live for 7 years. Have you found that you've had regrowth occurring over the time of your program?
Not with Bavlia. It hasn't happened much. I mean, maybe we found 8 or 10 instances where we've had, you know, a seed grow. The seeds don't tend to last very long in this particular case. And as I said, the seeds only germinate when they've actually had the seed coat weakened. So they tend to germinate very quickly after this happens. But we are now, I mean, one of the first things we had to do was to protect the whole project. So the year before we started the project, there's an old city wall that actually encloses the park. And the city wall had decayed. The city wall is 5 centuries old. And in many places the wall had decayed. And a conservation project actually rebuilt the wall, restored the wall before it became possible for us to actually do the project. And that allowed us to protect the outside of the project. We still then had to protect the inner roads coming inside. So all of that was done at great expense and great trouble, but it's allowed us to keep ungulates out. Although we have nilgais, we have antelope coming in now, but there's no Bavlia for them to eat, so it's okay.
Let me ask you 2 questions. One of them is very impressive what you do. How much has it influenced the environment, the birds, the bees? Is there any development on that side? And what will be, or what can you or we expect ultimately to be a permanent change in that desert? And secondly, a very pedestrian question, how costly is that enterprise? Is it something that is sustainable, that can be adopted in other places, or do you need a lot of money?
Okay, to answer the first question first, one of my biggest regrets is that we did not do baseline estimates of things like birds and butterflies and insects and grasshoppers when we began. We now have actually published, we've just published a little booklet on our butterflies. We have 90 species at the moment, which is amazing for a place in the heart of a city. It really is like an island in the city. But essentially what happens is that things that fly can find the park very easily. Things that hop or things that walk can't find the park that easily. So birds, we now have 190 species, which is again, a phenomenal number, but we don't really know how many birds we had at the beginning. But we had a huge number of pelicans this year in winter for the first time coming to a lake in the park, which was just amazing. What was the second part of your first question?
The financials.
That was the second question. Okay. So the fort, the trust that supports this work, the fort earns money from visitors to the fort, which is a museum, and they get 1.4 million visitors a year, which is an amazing number of visitors. And they have the vision to say, well, with this money, we're going to do things that we consider worthwhile. So we're a net outflow enterprise. We're not making money at all. Since 2012, we've had visitors coming in, paying 100 rupees to enter the park, paying another 100 rupees to hire a naturalist guide to take people in. We're probably making back something like 25% of our annual costs. So yes, it's net outflow. There's no way that it's not easy to make money doing something like this. It has to be an organization that has the kind of vision that the Mehrangarh Museum Trust has. I have to admit that last year the trust asked me to come in for a meeting and to present to the trust the work we've done over 10 years. And I thought, well, this is when I get the kiss off, when they say thank you for all you've done, but now we really need to go into maintenance mode and drop our money. To my delight and to my surprise, they said, what do you want to do next? Do you have any ideas of taking this park further? So they're amazing people to work with. I have nothing but unstinting. They're not here, so I'm not saying this for anybody's benefit. They really are amazing people, because this land could have been, developed into private apartments and buildings. They would have made millions and millions. But the fact that they decide to actually support something like this has been amazing. Does that answer your question? But yeah, so you wanted to what is the takeaway of something like this? You asked something about what can people learn from the lessons we've done?
My question was mainly, the first one, what will be the ultimate view of the park? I mean, what can we expect 10 years down the road? Just as you were confronted by the trust, I would ask you, what's next? How far can you go? What else can you expect? Or
we're not actually doing much planting anymore, except sometimes in tiny little places where we want it to look more interesting. Or if we find a new plant somewhere, then we actually want to make a little exhibit of it. So most of what we're doing now is interpretive work. It's work to enhance the experience of visitors. So we're publishing, we're doing more interesting signage, and we're now beginning to work towards a museum concept, which is going to be a digital museum about the history of life in the desert. So it's really going back, 200 million years and actually talking about how life has evolved in the Thar Desert in particular. Can you give them a mic? You have a mic?
Yeah, I have.
Sorry.
I'd just like to add that coming from the audience, Mehrangarh Museum Trust has been one place. The kind of cooperation you receive from that place is unbelievable. And it's only when you start working with them that you realize how unbelievably cooperative they've been. And with initiatives, and with experiments, and with people's ideas. My question to you is related to two areas of the fort. So one is Chokelao Bagh, which is an ordered garden. And the other is the biodiversity park, which has developed over the hillocks. So what is the similarity or variation between the ecology of Chokelao and this wilderness?
So Chokelao Bagh, nobody quite knows very much about the history of Chokelao. But Chokelao was given to a landscape architect from Delhi to design, and she's designed it. They call it an authentic Rajput garden. Some people don't think it's particularly authentic because most of the plants you find there are just common ornamentals that you see in nurseries all around you, and many of them are exotics. But I don't have anything to do with Chokelau. Chokelau has its own momentum and its own, it's directed by other people. Mics?
Sir, what was that idea that changed your life?
What was the idea that changed my life?
That changed your life.
Oh God, which part of my life?
Like when you were in a very tough time and like that idea came and like...
No, it didn't quite happen as a bolt from the blue. I'll pass that answer.
Hello. I am a resident of Jaipur, and I've living here since my birth. I've seen the hills around the city have gone dry from green. I mean, they were totally covered with forest when I was a young child. Now I've seen them totally gone dry. And I think one of the reason is because the government is not involving the local communities here. So what you have done in Jodhpur per se to involve the local people there and to encourage them to grow more trees and not, at least if not grow them, not to cut them in that case. What would you, it's the second part of my question, what would you suggest government, let's say in Jaipur, to conserve these forests, if not grow them at least?
Okay, I want to just very quickly tell you about two projects that I'm starting in Jaipur. One is an idea that's only 3 days old, but I met the principal chief conservator of forests in Rajasthan last week, and he wants us to actually work on a small 10-hectare plot of a dry rocky hill that is just off the Delhi bypass. And he says, show us that it's possible to do this, and we will replicate it in all the hills on the way, which I think is a wonderful thing on the part of the forest department to be able to see that something like this is possible. And we have accepted with great pleasure. So it's something we're going to probably start the coming monsoon. We also have a project in a place called Kishan Bagh, which you may or may not have heard of, in Vidyadhar Nagar, just next to Vidyadhar Nagar. This is a set of sand dunes that have basically blown towards the southwestern base of Nahargarh Hill. And because the sand dunes have met a hill, an impediment, they've stopped. They can't move anymore. And if you go to other parts of western Rajasthan, you find that wherever you get sand dunes that meet a hill like this, they actually become beautifully vegetated with natural desert plants and trees and shrubs. And some of the most beautiful sights and the most treasured photographs I have are actually these sandy fossil, we call them fossil dunes, with their vegetation right next to a hill which is rocky and has completely different vegetation. And that contrast makes for a very beautiful sight. So we want to try and do something similar in Kishan Bagh. But to come to your question about the hills, see what's happened is the forest department uses Prosopis juliflora, the same Baulia, in order to plant up hills so far. That's what they've been doing. They also use another plant called Acacia tortilis, which is from East Africa. And again, tortilis is invasive. Nothing nests in it. It's a useless plant. Nothing grows underneath it. So what the natural vegetation of the hills here would have been a tree called dhok. Dhok is one of the most beautiful trees you can imagine. It's not only beautiful, it actually forms what are called clonal forests. A clonal forest is a forest where you have one tree, and because conditions are so hostile, it's so difficult for its own seeds to germinate that the tree will actually have learned how to produce other trees from its root suckers. And these are actually not other trees, they're actually the same tree, the same DNA. So you can have a giant organism which looks like 2,000 trees, but actually is a single organism.
Wow.
And dhok does that. And dhok is the only tree that is capable naturally of growing on these very dry hills on steep slopes. If you go to Ranthambore, for example, Ranthambore would not be possible without dhok. Nobody plants dhok here. It's just, to my mind, unbelievable that the forest department doesn't just take dhok and hug it and say, you are our friend. They should do that. Sorry? We can talk after this.
Mr. Kishan,
Yes.
you've done a wonderful work in Jodhpur. My question, sir, is that you have taken a very small area. I have lived in those parts in and around Jodhpur, districts like Pali, Jaisalmer and other areas. Now, you would agree that large swaths of land with this aggressive plant. What stops these plants in other areas from, undoing your work?
What stops these plants from undoing my work in Jodhpur?
Yeah, because the surrounding areas are all, this aggressive plant.
So,
They can very well, it's such an aggressive plant, it can in a few years' time take over. It's such an aggressive plant.
So in the case of Bavlia in particular, unless an animal actually eats the fruit and is able to come into our area and it's present in its droppings, it won't in fact germinate in our area. So unlike a seed that is dispersed by the wind, for example, I mean a grass, if you had an invasive grass, for example, it's possible that the invasive grass could enter our area. But certainly not possible with Bavlia, it's not possible with Acacia tortilis either. So, grasses, by the way, are our greatest friend. We have 72 species of grasses in Raujodha Park, and I have a whole presentation which is only about the grasses. They're absolutely the most amazing things that we have in the park. How are we doing with time?
We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Hi. I was wondering, you said something about a South African seed being planted in Jaipur somewhere, and I was wondering what kind of effects it would have on the landscape and on the soil and everything to have a foreign seed planted over here versus a local one.
In fact, as I was reading, I think we have a lot of invasive plants all over India, and I think this is equivalent of tilapia in the water bodies that we have.
Absolutely. No, so
Bavlia.
everything I've been talking about with Bavlia is, it actually has a range that begins in Mexico and goes all the way down to Chile. So it's South American and Central American. And the effects of that are evident. It's invasive. It has, as I said, it destroyed Asia's largest grassland in a matter of 6 or 7 years. So it's terrible. The ecological effects are awful. But the problems are it's difficult to eradicate, it's expensive to eradicate, and you need to know how to do it. I don't actually know of any other agency that has done it anywhere in India. It's not that difficult. I mean, if 30 inches is not a lot, it's not a great height. If you have a place with a lot of soil, or if you have a sandy place, 30 inches is a piece of cake, especially if you use JCBs and mechanical means. But in rock, it's really, really hard.
Yeah,
But to answer your question, in a nutshell, sure. I mean, you have an invasive plant that doesn't have the normal checks and balances that it might have in its native places. It can run amok, and that's what it's done.
I think they had got some machine, Pradip, to kind of remove these, the Bavlia and I think Desi Babool and all that, as we call the Videsi Babool that we have.
Vilaiti babool, yeah.
Vilaiti Babool. Had they got a machine, I
I
heard
haven't
about it,
seen
which
one.
would kind of
I haven't
remove
seen
it
one,
from
I
the
haven't
soil
seen
now.
I was just going to ask, is this working? Yes. I was just going to ask, when you took us kindly for a walk, I did notice people were running goats over the hillside, which is obviously an important agricultural practice around here. Have you tested how resilient your rewilding vegetation is once the goats come back in?
No, I haven't. I haven't because we don't allow goats. We don't allow goats into our park. So it's quite possible that if you were to do this in a habitat that was unprotected, there would be selective damage depending on what goats prefer to eat. And goats can be extremely destructive in what they destroy. Any more questions? Okay. There's one in the back.
Sorry, as you've got a few minutes, this is more of a comment. Number one, as I come from Kew, my apologies. Number 2 is please stick with the miners. If you want a device, don't bring in some big machine. You're absolutely doing very well to use that indigenous technique. Thank you very much.
I'd like to just add a bit of information about the miners. We employed 15 of them. We used to call them our cricket team. We gave them cricketing hats. We gave them goggles to protect their eyes. They didn't use the goggles very long. But they actually stayed with us for 8 years, literally going plot by plot by plot, because it was the only viable way that we discovered to actually do this. And for the project that I was talking about in Jaipur, where we're doing a little hill, we're actually bringing 4 of them to teach their techniques to local people so that they can understand how to deal with rock. Here it's quartzite, there it's rhyolite, but still similar principles. All right, so let's wrap up. Well, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, there's one more question here. Sorry, I can't.
Are the pods useful? The pods of the Julie's flora?
Of the Juliflora? Yeah. No, so you know, when there are people who argue that Juliflora is actually quite a good plant to use. I don't quite understand that logic, but the kinds of reasons that they offer is that the pods are edible, so it is an animal feed. It's a fodder. The main argument is that it provides very good fuel wood to people who are poor and who otherwise have no access to fuel wood. It's a very high calorific value in the wood itself. And it provides habitat for small animals. So in a place that is otherwise perhaps bare and has nothing, it's better than nothing. But I'm not sure about that. It actually ruins areas as well.
And the other question I want to ask is, those beautiful plants you showed with flowers, how long do they take to flower?
Okay, so if you look at the entire gamut of species that will grow in a habitat like ours, something like 90% of the plants there are ephemerals. They are seasonal plants. They will germinate with the first rains. They will then rush through their life cycle in the space of about 3 months. So they're only using that little window of opportunity when there is moisture in the soil. And then they're dropping their seeds with hard-coated seeds. And those seeds will remain in the ground waiting for the following rains, which are 7 or 8 or 9 months away. That is the most typical way in which plants actually survive in the desert. Now, this is not true of all deserts. If you go to some deserts like the Karoo in South Africa, for example, you get a huge number of succulents. We don't have that many succulents here. We have some, but not a lot. The other way to survive in a rocky desert is to actually have deep roots. But it's hard to you can have deep roots in sand, but you can't do it in rock. Rock is too resistant to having deep roots. So the most common thing is to not be a tree, is to be small, not even shrubby. There are a few things that will grow as shrubs on rock, but mostly it's herbaceous things, herbs, small things that bloom, come into fruit, drop their seeds, and disappear within 3 months. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Pradip. It was indeed educational and inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.